February 27, 2026, 14:32 Zulu time. A commercial satellite operator in Colorado is reviewing routine imagery over the Arabian Sea. Standard pass, routine scan. Nothing flagged by the algorithm. Then he sees it. Masirah Island, a barren, wind-scorched strip of land off the coast of Oman. Population, fewer than 12,000. One airstrip, one Omani Air Force installation that barely qualifies as operational. And now, freshly graded roads cutting through the desert scrub, enormous dark rectangles arranged in neat rows near the shoreline, fuel bladder farms, military grade, enough to hold millions of gallons of JP-5 aviation fuel and F-76 marine diesel. 3 ships anchored offshore, not commercial vessels. USNS logistics ships, the kind that carry fuel, ammunition, and spare parts for a fleet at war. The United States Navy had built a secret forward operating depot on a deserted island, and they had done it without telling anyone. I'm your host at Navy Axis, where we break down the most critical naval operations shaping global power. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most consequential logistics decisions of the entire Persian Gulf crisis, a decision that never made headlines, was never briefed to Congress in open session, and was never acknowledged by the Pentagon. But it changed the war. Because in modern naval combat, the side that shoots first doesn't always win. The side that refuels fastest does. To understand why the U.S. Navy needed a secret fuel depot on a remote Omani island, you need to understand what was happening inside the Strait of Hormuz in early 2026. By February, the Persian Gulf had become the most dangerous body of water on Earth. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had deployed a layered denial strategy across the strait. Shore-based Noor anti-ship cruise missiles, reverse-engineered Chinese C-802s with a range of 120 kilometers, lined the coastline from Bandar Abbas to Jask, mobile launchers, hardened tunnels, dozens of pre-surveyed firing positions that could be activated in under 4 minutes. Behind those missiles sat the College Far's ballistic anti-ship missile batteries, range 300 kilometers, speed Mach 3 on terminal approach, specifically designed to strike large, slow-moving vessels like fleet oilers, vessels like ammunition ships. The IRGC didn't need to sink a destroyer, they needed to sink the trucks. And on February 9, 2026, they nearly did. USNS Rappahannock, a Henry J. Kaiser-class fleet replenishment oiler, 41,000 tons fully loaded, carrying 180,000 barrels of fuel, was transiting the Strait of Hormuz on a routine resupply run to the 5th Fleet in Bahrain. She had an escort. USS Stout, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, was running interference 2 nautical miles ahead. At 6:17 local time, Stout's AN/SPY-1D radar detected 2 fast-moving contacts launching from the Iranian coastline near Keshem Island. Classification: anti-ship cruise missiles, probable Noor variant. Speed, subsonic, approximately 0.9 Mach, sea-skimming trajectory, bearing directly for the Rappahannock. Stout responded immediately. The ship's Combat Information Center, the CIC, designated both contacts as hostile. 2 RIM-162, evolved Sea Sparrow missiles launched within 11 seconds. The first ESSM intercepted its target at 9,400 meters, clean destruction. The second missile suffered a guidance malfunction. It detonated 200 meters from the incoming Noor, but failed to achieve a direct hit. The damaged Iranian missile continued on a degraded trajectory. It struck the water 40 meters off Rappahannock's port quarter. The blast effect and shrapnel peppered the oiler's hull below the waterline. No penetration of the main fuel tanks, but the number 2 auxiliary engine room flooded. Rappahannock lost 30% of her electrical generation capacity and her ability to conduct underway replenishment, the pumping systems that transfer fuel to warships at sea. The ship survived, but she was combat ineffective as a logistics vessel, and that was the problem. Because Rappahannock wasn't just any oiler, she was one of only 3 fleet replenishment ships supporting the entire 5th Fleet operational area. With her out of service, CENTCOM's logistics chain had just lost a third of its at-sea refueling capacity in the most active combat theater on the planet. Rear Admiral Christine Vargas, commander of Task Force 53, the logistics arm of 5th Fleet, sent an urgent assessment to CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa within hours. The message was blunt. At current operational tempo, she reported, 5th Fleet destroyer and cruiser fuel reserves would reach critical levels within 96 hours unless alternative resupply arrangements were established. The remaining 2 oilers could not cover the gap. The math was simple and unforgiving. Every Arleigh Burke-class destroyer in the Persian Gulf burns approximately 1,000 gallons of fuel per hour at cruising speed. At combat speed, 30-plus knots, that consumption rate doubles. A destroyer operating at high tempo in a threat environment could drain its fuel tanks in 4 days. And once fuel hits 40%, doctrine requires the ship to disengage and transit to a resupply point. Ships without fuel don't fight, they retreat. CENTCOM needed a solution, and they needed it within days, not weeks. The conventional answer was Bahrain, naval support activity. Bahrain, home of the 5th Fleet, had pier-side fueling infrastructure, but Bahrain sat deep inside the Persian Gulf, 350 nautical miles northwest of the Strait of Hormuz. For a destroyer operating near the strait, a round trip to Bahrain meant 36 hours of transit at economical speed, 36 hours off station, 36 hours during which that ship was neither patrolling nor defending. Worse, every transit to Bahrain required passing through the strait itself, the same choke point where Iran had just demonstrated it could threaten logistics vessels. Sending warships through the strait to refuel was operationally necessary, but tactically absurd. Every transit was a roll of the dice. The second option was Fujairah, on the UAE's eastern coast, closer to the strait, technically outside the Gulf. But Fujairah was a commercial port, cramped, no military infrastructure, no ammunition handling capability. And the UAE government, already nervous about Iranian retaliation against its oil infrastructure, had quietly signaled that it preferred American warships not linger at its commercial terminals. There was a third option, one that existed not because someone planned for this specific crisis, but because decades of careful diplomacy had created an opportunity that most people had forgotten existed: Masirah Island. The relationship between the United States and Oman regarding Masirah stretches back to the 1970s. During the Cold War, the U.S. operated signals intelligence facilities on the island, monitoring Soviet naval activity in the Indian Ocean. After the Cold War, the formal American presence shrank, but the legal framework remained. A bilateral defense cooperation agreement, renewed quietly every 10 years, gave the United States access rights to Omani military facilities under certain conditions. Those conditions had just been met. On February 12, 2026, 3 days after the Rappahannock incident, a small team arrived on Masirah. They weren't wearing uniforms. They carried civilian identification. They arrived on a chartered turboprop from Muscat, not a military transport. This was deliberate. Oman's government maintained a diplomatic posture unique in the Gulf. It talked to everyone: Tehran and Washington, Riyadh and the Houthis. Oman's Sultan Haitham bin Tariq had positioned his country as a neutral mediator, and that neutrality was strategically invaluable. If it became public that Oman was hosting an American forward operating base during an active confrontation with Iran, that neutrality would evaporate overnight. The agreement, according to sources familiar with the arrangement, was verbal. No signed documents, no press releases. The Sultan's office approved the American request through a single intermediary, Oman's Minister of Defense, with 3 conditions. First, no permanent structures. Everything had to be temporary and removable within 72 hours. Second, no American military aircraft would be based on the island. Third, the arrangement would never be publicly acknowledged by either government. CENTCOM agreed to all 3 conditions within hours. Comment: logistics, if you think logistics wins wars more than weapons do. By February 15th, the first engineering elements were on the ground. Navy Seabees, construction battalion personnel, working alongside civilian contractors from a logistics support company based in Dubai. Their mission: build a functioning fleet resupply point from nothing in under 10 days. Masirah offered raw advantages that no other location could match. The island sits approximately 150 nautical miles southeast of the Strait of Hormuz, close enough to dramatically reduce transit times for warships, but far enough from the Iranian coastline to sit outside the effective threat envelope of most IRGC shore-based anti-ship missiles. The Noor missiles that had damaged Rappahannock had a maximum range of 120 kilometers. Masirah was over 750 kilometers from the nearest Iranian launch site. The island's eastern shore featured deep water approaches, natural anchorages where large vessels could hold station in 30 to 40 meters of water without dredging or pier construction. No piers meant no permanent infrastructure. Ships would anchor offshore and conduct fuel and ammunition transfers via floating hoses and helicopter vertical replenishment, VERTREP. The same methods the Navy uses during underway replenishment, adapted for a sheltered anchorage. The existing Omani airstrip, Masirah Air Base, had a 3,000-meter runway, concrete, capable of handling C-17 Globemaster III strategic transport aircraft. This meant ammunition, spare parts, and critical repair equipment could be flown in directly from Diego Garcia, 2,400 nautical miles to the south, or from Ramstein Air Base in Germany via intermediate staging. The Seabees went to work. In 7 days, they graded 4 kilometers of access roads connecting the shoreline to the existing airstrip. They positioned 24 inland petroleum distribution system fuel bladders, each capable of holding 210,000 liters, in a dispersed pattern along the western shore, hidden from direct satellite observation by a ridgeline that ran north-south through the island's center. Camouflage netting covered every bladder. They installed 2 tactical airfield fuel dispensing systems at the airstrip, allowing C-17s to land, offload fuel in collapsible containers, and depart within 90 minutes. A communications team established encrypted satellite links back to 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain and to CENTCOM in Tampa, portable water purification units, field medical facilities, berthing tents for up to 200 personnel. By February 22nd, 10 days after the advance team arrived, the Masirah Forward Logistics Site was operational. The first customer arrived the same day. USNS Big Horn, a Henry J. Kaiser-class oiler, anchored in the deep-water roadstead off Masirah's eastern coast at dawn. She had transited from Diego Garcia, loaded with 180,000 barrels of JP-5 and F-76. Behind her, USNS Medgar Evers, a Lewis and Clark-class dry cargo ammunition ship, carried Tomahawk cruise missiles, SM-2 Standard missiles, 5-inch gun ammunition, and critical spare parts for the Aegis combat system. A third ship arrived 2 days later, USNS Alan Shepard, another Lewis and Clark-class vessel, carrying additional ammunition stocks and a mobile crane system for heavy vertical replenishment operations. 3 logistics ships, anchored in protected waters, fully loaded, ready to service every warship in the theater. The operational impact was immediate and dramatic. Before Masirah, a destroyer operating near the Strait of Hormuz had to detach from its patrol area, transit 350 nautical miles to Bahrain, refuel alongside a pier or from an oiler in Bahrain's anchorage, and transit back. Minimum time, 36 hours. Often longer if pier space was congested or if the strait transit required additional escort coordination. After Masirah, that same destroyer could detach, sprint 150 nautical miles southeast to Masirah's anchorage, conduct a fuel transfer from Bighorn in 4 to 6 hours, rearm from Medgar Evers if needed, and return to station. Total time off the line, 8 to 12 hours. The math was transformative. Instead of losing a destroyer for a day and a half every resupply cycle, CENTCOM lost it for less than half a day. In a theater where every ship on station represented coverage of a specific patrol sector, anti-submarine warfare screens, anti-mine patrols, escort duties, that difference translated directly into combat power. Rear Admiral Vargas's logistics staff calculated that Masirah effectively increased 5th Fleet's available ship days on station by 22%, without adding a single new vessel to the theater. 22% more presence, 22% more coverage, from a fuel depot on a desert island. But the real value of Masirah didn't become apparent until March 11, 2026, 1:48 local time. USS Nitsa, an Arleigh Burke Flight 2A destroyer, hull number DDG-94, was conducting a mine countermeasures escort mission in the eastern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. Her assignment? protect the MH-53E Sea Dragon minesweeping helicopters operating ahead of a merchant convoy transit. The waters were shallow, charted depth 30 meters. The IRGC had been seeding the area with a mix of contact mines and more sophisticated EM-52 bottom influence mines, Chinese-designed weapons that sit on the seabed and detonate when they detect the magnetic signature of a passing ship. At 1:48, NHTSA struck a mine. The detonation occurred beneath the forward hull, approximately 15 meters aft of the bow. The blast effect generated a gas bubble that collapsed against the hull, rupturing the outer plating over a 3-meter area. Flooding began immediately in the forward sonar equipment room. The bow-mounted AN/SQS-53C sonar array was destroyed. 2 sailors in the forward compartment suffered serious injuries, one with a fractured pelvis, the other with internal bleeding from the concussive overpressure. NHTSA's crew responded with the speed that comes from relentless damage control training. Watertight doors sealed, dewatering pumps activated. The forward magazine was evacuated as a precaution. Within 14 minutes, the flooding was contained. NHTSA was still afloat, still under her own power, but she had lost her primary sonar, the main sensor that allowed her to detect submarines and mines. And she had taken on 800 tons of water that gave her a 4-degree list to starboard. NHTSA could still steam. She could still fight. Her Aegis system, her missiles, her guns were all functional. But she was wounded. A ship with compromised watertight integrity operating in waters where more mines were likely present was a ship at extreme risk of catastrophic loss if she hit a second mine. She needed to get out of the minefield. She needed repairs. She needed a safe harbor. Bahrain was 14 hours away at NHTSA's reduced maximum speed of 18 knots. 14 hours through contested waters with a flooded bow compartment and 2 critically injured sailors. Masirah was 5 hours away. At 2:15, NHTSA's commanding officer, Commander David Okafor, made the call. He turned his wounded destroyer southeast and headed for the island that officially didn't host any American military presence. NHTSA arrived at Masirah's anchorage at 7:20. A medical evacuation helicopter, launched from the Marine Expeditionary Unit operating in the Arabian Sea, was already waiting. The 2 injured sailors were airlifted to the USS Baton's medical facility within 40 minutes. Meanwhile, a damage control assistance team from USNS Medgar Evers boarded NHTSA. They brought portable pumps, welding equipment, and hull patching materials. Over the next 36 hours, working around the clock, they installed a temporary steel patch over the hull breach, dewatered the forward compartment, and restored watertight integrity to a level that allowed the ship to operate safely. NHTSA couldn't get her sonar back. That required a shipyard. But she could fight. And in the Persian Gulf in March 2026, every fighting ship mattered. She was back on station within 48 hours of the mine strike. Without Masirah, NHTSA would have spent 14 hours limping to Bahrain, then days in port waiting for repair resources that were already overcommitted. The Navy's 5th Fleet was operating with a fixed number of destroyers. Every day a ship spent in port was a day the patrol line had a gap. Masirah closed that gap, not with more ships, with geography. 4 days later, it happened again. March 15, 2026. USS Mitcher, DDG-57, another Arleigh Burke destroyer, detonated a mine while conducting a surface action group patrol north of the Al-Munasib Channel. The damage profile was similar to NHTSA's: hull breach forward, flooding, loss of the bow sonar dome, but Mitcher also lost her starboard shaft. One of her 2 propulsion shafts was knocked out of alignment by the blast, reducing her to single-shaft operation. Maximum speed, 14 knots. A destroyer that can only make 14 knots in a combat zone is a destroyer that cannot evade, cannot chase, and cannot maneuver aggressively. Mitcher was not just wounded. She was vulnerable. Commander Okafor's experience with NHTSA 4 days earlier had already been disseminated across the fleet. Mitcher's commanding officer, Commander Angela Torres, didn't hesitate. She turned for Masirah immediately. The transit took 7 hours at Mitcher's reduced speed, 7 hours during which the destroyer was escorted by an MH-60R Seahawk helicopter providing continuous mine avoidance surveillance ahead of the ship's track. Every mile was calculated. The helicopter's dipping sonar checked the water column ahead. Mitcher zigzagged through coordinates that had been swept within the previous 24 hours. She reached Masirah at 1845. By that point, the island's logistics site had evolved. What had started as a fuel depot was becoming something more, an emergency repair facility. The damage control teams that had patched Nizza had been reinforced by a 12-person mobile repair detachment flown in from Bahrain aboard a C-2 Greyhound. Mitcher's shaft repair was beyond what could be accomplished at anchor, but the repair team stabilized the shaft housing, reinforced the hull patch, and, critically, replaced the ship's AN/SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite, which had been degraded by the mine blast's electromagnetic pulse effect. That EW suite was Mitcher's ability to detect and jam incoming anti-ship missiles. Without it, she was blind to the IRGC's primary weapon. 40 hours at Masirah, 2 days. Then Mitcher was underway again, heading back toward the strait at 14 knots, slow but armed, patched, and electronically defended. Subscribe if you want to see how the Navy projects power through logistics, not just firepower. The 2 mine strikes, Nizza on March 11th and Mitcher on March 15th, exposed something that CENTCOM planners had feared but hadn't yet confronted directly. Iran's mine warfare campaign was working, not in the dramatic, headline-generating way that a missile strike on a carrier would work. Mines are quiet weapons. They don't produce satellite-worthy explosions. They don't trigger crisis meetings at the White House. They simply wait. And when a 9,000-ton destroyer hits one, the ship doesn't sink in a fireball. It limps away, damaged, diminished, one less asset on the line. The IRGC had seeded an estimated 300 to 400 mines across the eastern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz over the preceding weeks. A mix of old but effective Sadaf-02 contact mines, essentially copies of Soviet-era moored contact mines, and the more dangerous EM-52 bottom influence mines. The contact mines were relatively easy to detect and sweep. The bottom influence mines were not. They sat on the seabed in 20 to 40 meters of water, invisible to surface sweeping, and detonated based on the magnetic and acoustic signature of passing vessels. The U.S. Navy's mine countermeasures force in the Gulf was not equipped for this scale of threat. 4 Avenger-class mine countermeasures ships, wooden-hulled vessels specifically designed for the mission, were operating around the clock, but the Avenger class was old, commissioned in the early 1990s. Their systems were 30 years out of date. The Navy's next-generation mine warfare capability, the Littoral Combat Ships Mine Countermeasures Mission Package, had been plagued by developmental problems and was not yet operationally deployed in sufficient numbers. This was the error, the miscalculation that haunted every after-action review. The United States Navy had spent 2 decades focused on great power competition, building destroyers to fight Chinese submarines, carriers to project power against peer adversaries, and had systematically underinvested in mine warfare. The service that had nearly lost the Persian Gulf to Iranian mines in 1988 during Operation Praying Mantis had allowed its mine countermeasures capability to atrophy to the point where 4 aging ships were the primary defense against hundreds of modern mines in a war zone. Masirah couldn't solve the mine problem. No logistics depot could sweep a minefield. But Masirah could, and did, reduce the cost of the mine problem. Every ship that hit a mine and reached Masirah in 5 hours instead of 14 was a ship that returned to the fight days sooner. Every day saved in transit was a day that destroyers' patrol sector wasn't empty. By late March, the Masirah site had supported 31 individual ship resupply visits. 11 destroyers and cruisers had refueled there. 3 ammunition reloads had been conducted, SM-2 Standard missiles, evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, and 5-inch gun ammunition transferred from Medgar Evers and Alan Shepard to warships via helicopter vertrep and alongside transfer. 2 emergency repair operations, Nizza and Mitcher, had been completed. The fuel throughput alone was staggering. Bighorn and a rotating second oiler maintained a continuous supply of approximately 380,000 barrels of fuel on station at Masirah at any given time. C-17 flights from Diego Garcia, typically 2 per week, delivered additional fuel and collapsible bladders, along with ammunition and parts that couldn't wait for surface delivery. The island's personnel footprint had grown from the initial CB detachment of 40 to a sustained presence of approximately 180 military and contractor personnel. Still small, still deliberately inconspicuous. The Omani government maintained the fiction that the activity on Masirah was a routine bilateral exercise, a designation that technically required no parliamentary approval and generated no public documentation. But fictions have limits, and Masirah's fiction was fraying. The commercial satellite imagery that first revealed the depot on February 27th had been purchased by a Singapore-based open-source intelligence firm. Within 48 hours, that imagery was on social media. Analysts identified the fuel bladder configuration. Ship tracking data from AIS, the automatic identification system that commercial vessels are required to broadcast, showed the USNS logistics ships had gone dark in the waters around Masirah. When military ships turn off their AIS transponders, it confirms rather than conceals their presence to anyone watching. By March 5th, 3 major defense publications had published detailed analyses of the Masirah buildup. Satellite imagery comparisons, before and after, showed the road construction, the fuel farms, the communications antennas. One publication identified the specific USNS vessels by their hull profiles. Iran's foreign ministry issued a statement on March 8th, condemning what it called the illegal American military occupation of Omani territory in violation of Oman's declared neutrality. The statement demanded that Oman immediately expel all American military personnel from Masirah. Oman's government responded with silence. No confirmation, no denial. The Sultan's office issued a single sentence through its state news agency. Oman's bilateral defense relationships are conducted in accordance with sovereign agreements and international law. That was it. No elaboration, no press conference. Oman's diplomatic strategy was to say as little as possible and hope the story would be buried by larger events. It was, because on March 15th, the same day Mitchell hit her mine, Iran launched a coordinated strike on commercial shipping that dominated headlines for a week. 3 tankers hit by IRGC fast attack craft, firing RPGs and machine guns in the Western Strait. 1 tanker ablaze. Lloyd's of London suspended insurance coverage for Persian Gulf transits. Oil prices spiked to $127 per barrel. Masirah disappeared from the news cycle, which was exactly what both Washington and Muscat wanted, but the diplomatic damage was done. Inside the Gulf Cooperation Council, Oman's neighbors were furious. Saudi Arabia and the UAE had been pressing Oman for months to take a harder line against Iran. Oman had resisted, insisting that its role as a neutral mediator was more valuable than its role as a military partner. Now, satellite imagery showed American warships refueling off Oman's coast. The mediator had picked a side. Oman's foreign minister met privately with his Iranian counterpart on March 20th in Muscat. The details of that meeting remain classified, but sources described the Iranian diplomat as coldly furious. Iran had relied on Oman as a back channel, a place where messages could be passed, where quiet negotiations could happen. That channel was now compromised by the perception, if not the reality, of Omani complicity in American military operations. The irony was bitter. Masirah existed because of a relationship built on trust, and its exposure threatened to destroy that same trust, not between Oman and America, but between Oman and everyone else. This was the tale. The consequence that no logistics planner in Tampa had modeled. You can calculate fuel throughput rates and ship days on station. You can optimize transit distances and repair turnaround times. You cannot calculate the diplomatic cost of turning a neutral country into a perceived belligerent. Within the Pentagon, the assessment was more clinical. A classified after-action briefing prepared by CENTCOM's Logistics Directorate in late March described Masirah as the single most consequential logistics innovation of the campaign. The briefing noted that without the forward depot, Fifth Fleet would have been forced to reduce its destroyer presence in the Strait of Hormuz patrol zone by at least 2 ships, a reduction that would have created gaps in the anti-mine escort schedule and likely resulted in additional merchant vessel casualties. The briefing also noted something else, something that pointed to a larger truth about how modern navies fight. The entire Masirah operation, the construction, the fuel, The ammunition transfers, the repair operations, the communications infrastructure cost approximately $47 million over 6 weeks. $47 million, less than the cost of a single Tomahawk cruise missile salvo. For that investment, CENTCOM had gained the equivalent of adding 3 additional destroyers to the theater. Not by building ships, that takes years. Not by surging forces from other theaters, that creates vulnerabilities elsewhere. By putting fuel and ammunition in the right place at the right time. The United States military spends approximately $850 billion per year. It builds aircraft carriers that cost $13 billion each. It develops stealth fighters that cost $100 million per airframe. It maintains a nuclear arsenal that costs $60 billion per year to sustain. And the operation that arguably had the greatest tactical impact in the most active naval combat theater since World War II cost less than the catering budget for a single Pentagon conference. Logistics isn't glamorous. It doesn't make recruiting posters. No one watches a documentary about fuel bladders and says, "I want to do that." But every admiral knows the truth. Amateurs study tactics. Professionals study logistics. That line has been attributed to everyone from Napoleon to Omar Bradley. It doesn't matter who said it. What matters is that it is correct. Masirah proved it. A desert island, some rubber bladders, 3 cargo ships, and the entire operational geometry of a naval campaign shifted. But the story doesn't end with optimization metrics and logistics briefings, because Masirah also revealed a vulnerability that keeps naval strategists awake at night. The United States Navy, the most powerful naval force in human history, was forced to build a secret fuel depot on a borrowed island because it didn't have enough logistics ships to sustain combat operations through a contested strait. The numbers are stark. In 1990, during the First Gulf War, the U.S. Navy operated 110 logistics and support vessels, ships that carried fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, the unglamorous backbone of naval power. By 2026, that number had fallen to 49. 49 ships supporting a navy that was conducting simultaneous operations in the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Persian Gulf. The Rappahannock attack didn't create a logistics crisis. It exposed one that had been building for 30 years. Decades of budget pressure, shipbuilding choices that prioritized combatants over support vessels, and a strategic assumption that logistics would never be seriously contested. All of it converged on a single moment when one anti-ship missile damaged one oiler and suddenly an entire fleet was scrambling for fuel. Masirah was the solution. A brilliant, improvised, diplomatically perilous solution. But it was a solution that shouldn't have been necessary. A navy that depends on the goodwill of a neutral country to refuel its warships is a navy that has accepted a level of risk that no war planner should find comfortable. What happens next time? What if the strait isn't Hormuz but Taiwan? What if the borrowed island isn't Masirah but a Philippine atoll that China claims as sovereign territory? What if the neutral partner isn't Oman, a country with 50 years of American alliance history, but a government that owes more to Beijing than to Washington? These aren't hypothetical questions. They are the questions that the Masirah experience forced onto the desk of every flag officer in the United States Navy. The fuel bladders have been partially drawn down. The Seabees have graded a maintenance road that keeps the site accessible. USNS Bighorn rotates with her sister ships on a schedule that keeps at least one fully loaded oiler at anchor off Masirah at all times. The site continues to function. The diplomatic fiction continues to hold. The Omani government continues to say nothing. But the island knows what it is now. Not just a fuel depot. Not just a repair point. Masirah is a warning. A warning that the world's most expensive military can be brought to its knees not by hypersonic missiles or stealth submarines, but by the absence of a tanker truck at the right place at the right time. And a warning that the next war, wherever it happens, will be won or lost not in the combat information center of a billion-dollar destroyer, but in the logistics spreadsheet of an officer nobody has ever heard of, calculating whether there is enough fuel to keep the fleet in the fight for one more day. One more day. That's what Masirah bought. One more day of presence, one more day of patrols, one more day of deterrence. In war, one more day is everything.